Welcome to today's Explainer. I am so excited to share this one with you because we're unpacking a truly chilling story. We're going to explore the fascinating legend of the cursed palace and the abandoned cabin. It's a story that perfectly blends suspense, mystery, and honestly, a pretty profound lesson about the human condition. I put together a great breakdown for us today, so get comfortable and let's just jump right in.
So have you ever heard of a man whose fortune brought only death? I mean, imagine being so wealthy that people actually feared your money rather than envying it. Well, this is the dark reality for our story's central figure, a rich man named Hassan. He had this magnificent palace, priceless treasures, beautiful gardens, the whole shebang. But his name was whispered in fear across the city. Why? Because every family knew that marrying into Hassan's immense wealth was essentially a death sentence.
All right, let's dive into part 1, the cursed palace.
You see, Hassan's previous wives had all died mysteriously within just months of their weddings. No healer could cure them, and nobody could explain it. The entire city became utterly convinced that the palace itself was cursed, and families flat out refused his proposals. So desperate to find a wife, Hassan traveled to a distant village. He offered a really handsome dowry, 20 sheep for a young, kind-hearted woman named Safiya. Now, for her poor family, this was literally life-changing wealth, but the joy was tragically short-lived. Just 2 months after a beautiful 3-day wedding, Safiya grew utterly weak. She lost all her strength and passed away. The village mourned one of their sweetest, while Hassan was left completely alone once again.
Now, after Safiya's funeral, Hassan actually asked to marry her younger sister, Rabah. As you might guess, the family was horrified and immediately said absolutely not. But the contrast between these two sisters was stark. Safiya was known for her radiant beauty, yet she was doomed by the palace. Rabah, on the other hand, was pragmatic, calm, and incredibly wise. She bravely stepped forward, realizing this was pretty much her only chance to escape crushing poverty. She reasoned that her fate might be different. So, going against her family's terrifying fears, she accepted the proposal.
Which brings us to Act 2, the Forbidden Cabin.
When Rabah arrived at this enormous, king-like palace, she was absolutely blown away by its elegant halls and rare antiques. But as she was taking in the property, she noticed something highly unusual tucked away out in the garden. It was this mysterious, overgrown wooden cabin. She immediately felt an eerie sensation. You know, that feeling like someone is watching you from the inside. But before she could even ask about it, Hassan's demeanor turned ice cold. He delivered a really harsh warning. Never go near that cabin. There are things you're better off never knowing. It was a chilling, sudden shift from his normally kind behavior. Rabah agreed to stay away, but man, that strange feeling of being watched never left her.
Now, despite that ominous warning and the dark history of Hassan's previous wives, Rabah miraculously survived for 6 whole months in perfect health. This is absolutely crucial because it proved to Rabah that the danger, the supposed curse, wasn't the palace itself. She and Hassan actually grew very close, and the neighbors even began whispering that perhaps the curse was finally broken. But the real mystery was just quietly waiting.
During those 6 months, Rabah started noticing some deeply unsettling anomalies around the estate that were just impossible to ignore. First, as she looked at the ancestral family portraits lining the halls, she realized they only showed men. Not a single wife was painted. Second, every single servant in the massive palace was old. Literally not one young woman was employed there. And finally, there was that constant nagging feeling of being watched from the dusty windows of that locked, overgrown cabin in the garden.
And then comes the classic catalyst for discovery. Hassan had to depart on a month-long business journey. Before he left, he handed Rabah a heavy ring of keys, telling her she had permission to explore any of the locked rooms in the palace to keep from getting bored. And he rode off down the road, completely unaware that he had just handed his new wife the very key to the forbidden cabin, and really, the darkest secret of his family's past.
Okay, moving on to Act 3. The ghost escapes.
So left all alone in this massive, echoing palace for an entire month, Rabah's curiosity about the cabin and her sister's death really began to consume her. It perfectly mirrors that classic campfire ghost story trope, right? The protagonist is given exactly one rule, and human curiosity just compels them to break it. Her dread escalated through a series of terrifying signs. One night, she stepped onto her balcony and saw a warm orange light glowing from the window of the locked cabin. When she crept down to investigate, her gray cat stopped dead in its tracks, fur standing on end, and let out a long, frightened hiss at the door. And then came the most chilling sign of all. She saw a shadow sprinting across the garden that looked exactly like her dead sister Safiya, darting right behind the cabin.
Seeking answers, Rabah slipped into town and met an old man riding a donkey. When she casually asked about the palace, his face just completely drained of color, and he gave her this chilling warning. He said, no young woman has ever entered that palace and escaped its curse. He told her the lore, that a murdered lady's spirit wanders the grounds at night, searching for young brides to take their lives while they sleep. Rabah was absolutely terrified, but she knew she needed to know the truth.
Following the shadow of her sister, Rabah stood before the creaky wooden door. She inserted the small key from Hassan's ring. With a loud groan, the door opened. But inside? Nothing. No fire, no mysterious woman with braided hair. Just years and years of thick dust, spiderwebs, and broken furniture. It was completely empty. Confused, she locked it back up and went to her room. But what she didn't realize was that by simply opening the door, she had unknowingly broken a protective seal. That night, the true horror began. Rabah woke up to the strong smell of smoke. Paralyzed with fear, she opened her eyes to see a terrifying ghost standing in her bedroom. Half of the woman's face was horribly blackened and burned. But the ghost didn't speak. She didn't attack. She just stood there in the dark, watching Rabah in total silence. Rabah actually passed out from terror. The next morning, a maid revealed the horrifying truth to her. Opening the cabin had set the spirit free. The only reason Rabah survived the night was that the ghost hadn't physically touched her yet. Completely terrified, Rabah packed her bags and fled straight back to her father's house.
Now, what's really interesting here is Act 4, the grandfather's dark secret.
When Hassan finally returned from his trip, he found his wife gone and the servants absolutely terrified. Realizing Rabah had opened the cabin, he was consumed with fear and immediately rode to her village. Finding her miraculously alive, he sat her down to explain the horrifying origin of the curse. A century ago, Hassan's grandfather built the palace and lived happily with his first wife, Dalilah. But a few years later, he bought and married a beautiful young second wife. Consumed by jealousy, this second wife framed Dalilah by hiding black magic objects in Dalilah's belongings inside the cabin. When the grandfather found them, he didn't even ask for an explanation. Furious and betrayed, he dragged Dalilah out and set fire to her cabin of belongings. In a desperate panic, Dalilah ran back inside to save her precious things. The flames trapped her, and she tragically burned alive.
And that right there is exactly how the curse begins. Dalilah didn't just pass on. Her vengeful, traumatized spirit returned. She attacked the jealous second wife, disfiguring her face to look as though it had been burned. Before dying, the second wife actually confessed to framing Dalilah. The grandfather was totally destroyed by guilt, spending the rest of his life begging for forgiveness outside the cabin. When he died, a holy man was brought in. He sealed the vengeful spirit inside the cabin, warning the family that as long as the door stayed locked, they were safe.
But whenever a new bride arrived and ignored the warning, the ghost of Dalilah, believing she was being replaced all over again, would attack. Hearing this, Rabah has this massive realization. Dalilah isn't some purely evil monster. She's a profoundly traumatized victim, acting out of a century of pain, betrayal, and jealousy.
Which leads us to our final act, breaking the curse.
Up until now, Hassan's family had tried to handle the haunting through force, right? Like trying to tear the cabin down or locking the spirit away with holy seals. But Rabah realized that a supernatural force wasn't going to fix this. What Dalilah needed was empathy. So she outlined this really beautiful plan. First, instead of tearing the ruined cabin down, they were going to respectfully restore and clean it. Second, they would carefully and respectfully retrieve Dalilah's remains from beneath the cabin floor. And finally, they would take her remains to the cemetery and bury her side by side with her husband. Rabah realized that they were separated in life by lies, so they needed to be reunited in death.
And guess what? It works beautifully. They bury the couple together, and Rabah and Hassan read a prayer for their souls. Instantly, a soft wind passes through the trees, and that heavy, terrifying presence just vanishes from the palace grounds. The curse is lifted forever, not by magic, but by empathy and forgiveness. Later that evening, looking out at the peaceful cabin, Rabah playfully jokes to Hassan that if he ever even thinks about marrying another woman, she'll become an even worse ghost than Dalilah. Hassan laughs, swearing he has definitely learned his lesson.
Which brings us to the most important takeaway of this entire explainer. Dalilah's spirit only found peace when Rabah finally stopped being afraid and took the time to truly listen to her pain. It makes you think, doesn't it?
So, what old curses or long-standing grudges in your own life, or maybe in your family, are just waiting to be lifted? Because sometimes all it takes is a little bit of empathy to put a painful history to rest. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep analyzing, and I'll see you next time.